Hi everyone, welcome back to Britain's in History. What follows in this video is an audio booklet which I've recorded based on the notes I was privileged enough to digitise from Wilson and Blackett's unpublished work. And it acts as a really good introduction into the topic of King Arthur as per their research. And hopefully, if you're new to the topic, you come away with it with a sense of, well, why don't we look for King Arthur and Glamorgan as they've proposed and convincingly concluded. But if you're a Wilson and Blackett hardcore fan, there is still some new information in there for you, and hopefully, if nothing else, you'll enjoy listening to the words of Baron Blackett and Alan Wilson and through their research. But if you don't want to listen to that through the medium of my voice, which I totally understand, we're going to be publishing a digital ebook, if there's any interest expressed in that, of this digitised copy of how the King Arthur research developed, which is the title. And hopefully it will lead you to want to explore and research more into this as through their research. Cumberglyphics has just republished this book, Arthurius Rex Discovered, and absolutely highly recommend this book to start if you're new to Wilson Blackett and Britain's in History, or if you're just interested in King Arthur, because it was absolutely enough to convince me, and I've looked at many different theories over the years, been interested in this for years. And Wilson and Blackett, I think, are the most convincing. Thanks for watching, and if there's any expressed interest in this format, I will continue to do what I can to digitise the notes. There will be books coming, of course, through Cumberglyphics, but also there's things we can just make good videos and good content, so I'll do my best to continue that. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Alan Wilson began looking casually at the history of South East Wales in 1956. He had realised that the versions of history presented by the London establishment for consumption in schools and colleges were incredibly lopsided and showed large black holes where everything had vanished. This was all the more strange, as the Welsh have occupied their territories since the two ancient seaborne invasions, which brought them here around 1567 BC and again in 500 BC. Their histories are copious, well documented, multi-sourced, and whenever a check of proof is possible, they ring out true. The idea or propaganda that they are absences of evidence and lack of information always trace back to London and the sycophantic English universities. For some 500 years, they have been churning out childish nonsense, all in keeping with obvious political activities traceable to AD 1189 to 90 and Edward I. So, there was a massively recorded detailed history, which had been deliberately guided off course and equally suppressed by the politics of a large powerful country seeking to dominate a smaller neighbour. A spy-catching exercise was necessary, and from the outset it became clear that the most secretive and entrenched establishment in the world would resist. The first and most obvious direction to take was to investigate the 6th century Glamorgan Gwent king named as Arthur, ap Moerig ap Tudrig, and proclaimed by countless Welsh authors in print since around 1760. The King Arthur of legends, histories around 1100 to 1450 preceding the introduction of printing in 1474. All after Caxton set up his London printing press in 1474 and the minor royal Welsh branch of the Tudors from North West Wales as opposed to the south got into the English throne in 1485 did things change. So there was not much of a mystery of a conspiracy to face. That there was a king named Arthur, son of Myrig, son of Theodric, Tudrig, and so on is undeniable. He figured as such in all genealogies, in the great cathedral charters, in the lives of the saints, copiously in the 6th century poetry, and amazingly on several 6th century memorial stones. He is in fact harder to miss than find. That there is an ongoing cover-up is very clear and provable, and this needs to be exposed. As an obvious example, the ancient coastal fortress of Din Drivan, now bent into the meaningless English Dunraven, stands on the Glamorgan cliff coasts. Tradition is that this was one of the major courts of the Glamorgan kings, so the authorities have erected some charts including the lists of the Glamorgan kings who fought the Romans from AD 42 to 51. The list trots along until it gets to the 6th century. Then it reads King Tudrig, King Myrig, blank, King Morgan, etc. Now everyone knows that King Arthur was the son of King Myrig, and equally everyone knows that immutable record state that King Morgan succeeded King Arthur. Yet here we find Arthur deliberately omitted. The tourists are not to be told. In the same way, dozens of people interested in the research have printed out a strange series of entries in a book by Harney Griffith in 1980 titled Welsh Personal Names. Actually, 1,000 of them. Harney Griffith succeeds in producing a series of entries which reads like this. 1. Marchel, daughter of Tudrig, chief of Brecon, mother of Brechan Brecheniog. Tudrig, grandfather of Brecon, father of Myrig, king of Glamorgan. Myrig, king of Glamorgan, 6th century, grandfather of Morgan. Morgan, grandson of Myrig, son of Tudrig. Strangers might easily see Queen Marchel and King Myrig is married, with Brechan as their son, and Morgan as Brechan's son. This is how the entries appear. Yet again clearly Marchel and Myrig are brother and sister. Why is the son of Myrig omitted in the entry of Myrig? Why does entry 2 on Tudrig name Brechan as Tudrig's grandson, and then name Myrig as Tudrig's son, omitting Myrig's own son? If a simple family tree is drawn down, what emerges is the standard establishment line. It is no accident that again, everywhere else, the son of King Myrig is omitted. In the same way, strange things happened to two of the great book repositories in Wales in the 19th century. One of the shores of Milford Haven, easily approached by ship, was burned down by arson in the late 19th century. The other, again privately owned, was to be sold off, following the death of the owner. Prospective purchasers gathered in droves down from everywhere to this great historical treasure house. At the auction, however, only 3 unimportant manuscripts were offered for sale. The hundreds of great important manuscripts frequently consulted by visitors and scholars had all disappeared. There is little point in pursuing the why and the wherefore of all of this. King Arthur, son of Myrig, appears in the ancient texts under miscellany of spellings, as do most other ancient kings. He is Arthur, Arthwyr, Arthrois, Arthvale, Arthmael, and so on. On one 6th century land grant stone found at Ogmore Castle, King Arthmael appears granting land to Nertat, who is the daughter of Brechan of Brecon, and to Philly the bishop, a grandson of St Gildas, and Bishop of Ulwen of Llandaff. All are clearly related and all are 6th century. It should therefore surprise no one that an English royal commission of a horde of experts decided to redate the stone to the 10th century in 1948. This is barefaced skullduggery and absurd. Less than half a mile away, there is another 6th century stone naming Cahelin, a brother of King Meurig and so Arthur's uncle, and the same Nertat, daughter of Bricken. In short, it's a frame-up. The same thing happens to the royal memorial stones. In all ancient lands, the great stones were set up by the kings. Yet here we are told that the great memorial stones were set up by nobodies, who have names which are not actually names. The stone clearly marking the ascension to the throne of King Tithfelt Theodosius, who was either father or brother of King Tudrig, is styled as the Stone of Grutna, and also claimed the name Ahest, and of course Ahest is simply an atheist. The stone of King Tudrig is mangled into the stone of Einion. The process of mistranslation and deception is very simple. The accession stone of Maelgwn Gwynedd, who was elected after the death of Arthur ap Meurig, was found on Hirwaun Common. It had 4 lines of writing, the first 2 with the words Ire Cor was murdered into Iracorius and Maglori into Maglorius. Then the unsuspecting public was misinformed that this ludicrous Iracorius was another name, and that Maglorius was also a name. So 4 words, 1 name. Maglo, Maelgwn were blended into 2 impossible names, and non-existent Ius was added to each to make it look good. So the statement of Maelgwn's accession was obscured. It gets worse for the 9-foot and 7-ton stone of King Aethiel, well attested as brother of King Morgan and successor of King Arthur. Gwerithla Rheinglida, a sister of King Meurig, being Illtyd's mother, and it also carries Arthmael Ticani. Now, Tekum means with 3, and there can be no argument about that. But this Ticani, as reads originally when the stone was re-excavated in 1793, and it still reads, is purported, piles upon absurdity, as more and more lies and deceptions are constantly required to plaster over the ever-widening chasm opening under the original lies and distortions. This, of course, is only a selection of the senseless inanities. The 6th century stone of Pompey, the kinsman of Arthur, is mangled into the 5 fingers of my brother, killed here. Yet all histories and records affirm that Howell of Brittany brought his army into Britain as Arthur's ally. Welsh historical tradition states that Howell rejoiced in the titular name of Pompey the Great. Howell Pompey was a close relative of Arthur ap Meurig, and both were 6th century. So what exactly is the problem? Why are all these books churned out by the Anglo-Saxons and now Americans proclaiming this mystery? Some of the forgeries and deceptions of the establishment are better known. When is 1536 Polydore Virgil, the Italian court historian of King Henry VIII, simply pointed out that King Arthur would need to be around 200 years old to fight A, the Romans around 380, and B, to fight the Angles, Picts, Irish and Scots and Saxons around 550. This caused an uproar. The king's antiquary, John Leyland of Somerset, was, it seemed, stupid enough to believe the Glastonbury forgeries, and John Leyland, as travelling antiquary, immediately set about altering the placements around Cadbury Hill in his native Somerset, and fabricated the deception that Cadbury Hill was Camelot. Those interested see Leslie Alcock's book King Arthur's Britain, about which he knows absolutely nothing, page 163, paperback edition. Welsh records and some Welsh scholars already stated that there are two King Arthurs. The first was Androgathius to the Latins, and Arthur to the British, a son of Maxen Wledig Magnus Maximus by his first wife Cyndric, daughter of Rhydian. This Arthur seized Paris from the Lady Guinevere, defeated the Roman Emperor Gratian at Soissons, Sassy, and killed Gratian at Lyon, all in 383 AD. He then proceeded to conquer all of Western Europe for his father, the ageing Magnus Maximus. He was also known as Manguir Cerguithelen, anglicised to Guy of Warwick. This is Arthur I, whose grave are described by Caradoc of Llancarvan in 1156 as being at Glastonbury in Warwickshire. The illustrious Harleian manuscript 3859, the Black Book, specifically states that Glastonbury is near Lichfield. Even Edward Lloyd, the learned Lloyd, writing around 1600 in his itineraries, states this. The fake Somerset Glastonbury was not founded until 942 by King Edgar of the English. It was a small funerary chapel for Edgar, and he and his two other English kings were buried there. St Dunstan was the first abbot. See Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. The second King Arthur is in fact a direct descendant of the first Arthur, of Magnus. The 1,000-year-old Brecon manuscript detail these 3 times over. Every other record corroborates this. So, we have 2 identifiable traces of these kings, one buried in the Midlands in Warwickshire and other buried in Glamorgan. It is that simple. Amongst the multitudes of deceptions, most of the vital 6th century historical poetry was published by a Scotsman named Skene in 1869. A Scotsman publishing deciphered archaic Welsh poetry should have alarmed somebody. Everybody, in fact. These amazingly childish, ludicrous and laughable translations are now dinosaurs in print. Anyone writing on King Arthur simply quotes these absurdities as gospels. How can a man translate "monks howled like dogs in a kennel" when the text reads "monks carried the leader ruler to the choir for burial"? These nonsenses of Skene's have persuaded thousands of writers and millions of readers that the songs of the graves contain the information on around 182 to 200 long-dead kings and princes. In 1958, W. Thomas, giving the Rees Memorial Lecture, warned that there at most only 80 names, and adjectives, adverbs, verbs, nouns, etc. were being misread as names of kings. This monstrosity, perpetuated by Skene and advertised as historical gospel, proclaimed that King Arthur was mentioned in only one line in these songs of the graves. Odd as a minor king gets 3 whole line verses. Actually, the geographical description of King Arthur II's grave occupies 2 whole verses. Skene says, Elthwyth is a name, yet El means extremely, and Quith means windy. The much quoted line, "A knoweth bit bed Arthur," is said to read, "Concealed forever the grave of Arthur." Actually, it reads, "A bare exposed place for the grave of Arthur." We are told it is a damp bog place, a very windy place, a bare exposed place, and a very narrow place. Then to cap it off, we are actually told the name of the field in which the grave stands. It is harder to miss than to find. It seems that someone has been most economical with the truth for a very long time. The realisation that the history of South East Wales is not a gigantic forgery concocted artfully by thousands of monks and historians over a 1500-year period and spread across some 40,000 square miles, and that this monster forgery, complete with the ancient fortresses, manors, churches, and stone coffins with skeletons, over 200 memorial stones, royal grave mounds, is in fact simple complication of the truth, should awaken someone. The idea that the cathedral and abbey charters, the histories, the royal genealogies, and the lives of the saints, the mass of historic poetry, the Welsh triads, the ancient inscribed stones, are all over vast interlocking composite forgery, needs to be abandoned as the utter rubbish that it is. From the 2 King Arthur discoveries, the project proceeded to examine the whole of the ancient history. The migration from Phrygia, Asia Minor, from 500 BC was tested. Even Oxford scholars in 1846 published that South Wales Colbram, virtually identical with the untranslatable Etruscan and Phrygian. As the Etruscans left for Phrygia around 650 BC, it is obvious that a language and alphabet transfer took place from Asia Minor to Etruria and to Britain. Not surprisingly, no academic attempted to decipher the indecipherable Etruscan or Phrygian using Welsh. Then these things were taking off around the 1930s. A spanner hit the works from the North Wales poetry expert G.J. Williams, who knew zero of the history. This academic establishment puppet calmly proclaimed that very ancient Colbran alphabet had been a forgery, and proceeded to label all South East Wales history a forgery. Another clown deterred research. We find that both Etruscans and Phrygians read accurately in Welsh, giving historically correct, meaningful, coherent text. Naturally, G.J. Williams made no attempt to explain why a 2nd century AD stone in Britain is inscribed in Colbran, nor did he bother with 4 well-known 6th century stones in England and Scotland. Nor did he concern himself with the great memorial stone of AD 948. Neither did he bother to explain the Oxford Bodleian Library manuscript of 572. He simply announced that the alphabet was a forgery of around 1800. The establishment were delighted. The universities terrified and kept well away. As for us, well, we sit simply to decipher these ancient stones in both Britain and ancient Etruria and Phrygia, back to 650 BC, some forgery. Having seen that the establishment was trying to close down all avenues and totally suppress the history, we decided to look at the very strange triad statement that the Egyptian hieroglyphs were written in Welsh. A very strange business. Both languages having also the same 7 vowels, A, E, I, O, U, W, Y. It does not take a genius to see that all the pharaohs were styled Never-Hotep, said to mean heaven beloved, and that heaven beloved is Welsh and still Neville Haughton. We set up an exercise to construct a system to attempt decipherment, and so we have not only found one single Egyptian text which does not decipher and translate accurately. We enclose a very few simple samples. What all this means is that Britain has a very accurate and very truthful history, all very well recorded, back to the origins of the nation, as resulting from the great fleet migrations from Syria and Asia Minor in around 1567 BC and 500 BC. King Arthur is very simply a bright star in this shining galaxy. The urgent need is for positive university involvement anywhere. Anyone with the will and intelligence to see this vast opportunity opening up. There is no need to be economical with the truth, as we are revealing a vast abundance of truths. In January of 1976, Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett decided to formally and seriously go in search of the grave of the legendary King Arthur. This decision to search would have been regarded as both futile and absurd by the vast majority of scholars, if not by all of them. Few serious and informed people believe in the clearly bogus and false claims of the monks of Glastonbury Abbey, who claim to have discovered King Arthur and his Queen Guinevere buried together in 1191. This patently obvious fraud somehow seems to memorise and deter scholars from a properly organised investigation. The Baron Blackett view was that because the Glastonbury fraud had apparently paralysed any authentic search for centuries, creating a vast inertia, the opportunity for discovery was totally unhindered and untouched. To quote, "We have a clear field, as no one else has ever seriously tried to find King Arthur." In 1915, Theodore Davis abandoned his permits and licence to dig in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. He withdrew because he believed there was nothing else to be discovered, and that the possibilities of finding further tombs of pharaohs were exhausted. This generally accepted view was not, however, shared by Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter, and Lord Carnarvon took up Theodore Davis' permit to dig. For 7 years, Howard Carter dug whilst Lord Carnarvon funded his efforts, in what was considered a vain effort, to locate the missing tomb of Tutankhamun. There was considerable doubt at the time that Tutankhamun had actually existed or reigned, and a general expectation of failure. In 1922, however, Carter found that there was what was not supposed to exist. When he discovered the tomb of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun, there is a strange parallel with the uncomfortable inertia in Britain concerning the identity of King Arthur, his ancestry, his personal territories, and of course, his residence and grave. Many scholars have opted for the easy way out and have simply stated that Arthur did not exist, and therefore the difficulties involved in tracing him no longer exist. This device of making the whole problem disappear is generally a farce of face-saving manoeuvre, which absolves the scholar from having to admit failure. There is, however, in Britain a vast quantity of Arthurian historical record and physical evidence, which, for a variety of potent reasons, has been resolutely ignored and set aside. Whilst the average general reader is informed that there are a few vacant references and remains of King Arthur, this great warehouse of detailed record remains locked, barred and closed as inadmissible evidence. In 1976, one Oxford-educated author wrote that it would be a miracle if any further discovery of Arthur were ever made. In fact, the reverse is the truth. It would be a miracle if a vast volume of authentic evidence was to continue to be ignored and misrepresented. All jingoistic nationalism, all political chicanery, and all scholastic bias has to be set aside for once and for all, if Dark Age British history is to be restored to a position of respectability. The Mongols did not lose Genghis Khan. The Tartars did not lose Tamerlane. The Egyptians did not lose their pharaohs. The people of ancient did not lose their emperors. As Leonard Woolley discovered, nor more in recent times did the French lose Napoleon. It does not happen. Even the tomb mound of the infamous Herod the Great is known and exists, and even the grave of Philip II of Macedonia, father of Alexander the Great, has been found and opened. Wilson and Blackett knew that most of the detailed evidence in King Arthur has never been taken into account. Much evidence has been distorted and subjected to all manner of faking and forgery, particularly at Glastonbury at Cadbury in Somerset and Tintagel in Cornwall, which can be proved quite conclusively to have no connection whatsoever with any King Arthur. This false trail in the west of England has thrown all previous and serious study into hopeless confusion. To allow the fake sites of Glastonbury Abbey, Cadbury Hill and Norman Castle at Tintagel to enter the equation is to destroy all hope of success. It is as sane and useful as hunting for polar bears in Nigeria. As will be shown, Glastonbury of King Arthur is elsewhere, for Glastons in Breton and Cornish and Welsh means place of oak trees, and could be anywhere. Glasthenin in Welsh signifies to scarlet oak. One impeccably authentic manuscript of at least 1,000 years standing, pre-Norman and therefore uncontaminated, states precisely the location of Glastonbury. It places it where it ought to be, in Warwickshire. Tintagel is obviously Dindagle, of the Welsh name, and means double-banked hill fort, and again it could be anywhere. Yet another very ancient and impeccable manuscript source actually states double-banked hill fort in relation to Arthur it is called the Castle of Birth in English. As for Cadbury Hill in Somerset, when Henry VIII's court historian Polydore Virgil pointed out clearly around 1532 that King Arthur of the histories was an utterly impossible figure, John Leyland invented the monstrous fake. Polydore Virgil simply states the obvious by pointing out that if King Arthur fought the Romans and also mid-6th century Saxons, then he would have been around 200 years old at least. John Leyland was the king's antiquary and native of Somerset, and his wild reaction was to forge and fake place names all around Cadbury, to invent the idea that Camelot was originally at this site. All this will be set out in detail. The 1191 Glastonbury face and faking, the 1534 forgeries of Leyland, and the fact that no 6th century fortress existed at Tintagel in Cornwall either. By clearing away this camouflage and applauding a set of deceptions, the way can be cleared to actually go on to discover King Arthur. The advantage held by Wilson and Blackett was that they were able to cross over the ridiculous petty jealousies which are constantly evident in the vast majority of modern books written on King Arthur. Blackett is English and Wilson is Welsh, with one English grandfather. Neither was worried at all where Arthur was found, just so long as he was found. In 1976, they already knew King Arthur was in fact two quite separable people. He was a medieval mistake, a combination of two powerful war kings of the time of the British. The first, Arthur, was variously known as Arthur Anhun or Anun, and so on and generally designated the Black, in Welsh the, and in Latin text Negri. In the Roman context, he was known as Androgathius, the son of Magnus Maximus, by Magnus's first British wife. This Arthur Androgathius did in fact conquer the Western Roman Empire between 383 and 388 AD, and his father's chief and general did in fact kill Gratian, the Roman emperor, with his own hands. This is the King Arthur reordered and buried at Glastonbury by the Welsh Caraddoc of Llancarvan, where his grave lies detailed in Warwickshire. The second Arthur was the 7th generation direct descendant of Arthur I, son of Maxim Wledig, and is easy to see how Arthur II at Moira could be confused with Arthur I at Maxim Wledig. This King Arthur II was king of Glamorgan and Gwent, and it was he who fought and defeated the Angles, Saxons and Picts and Scots and others. This, therefore, is where the search begins. Both Arthur I at Maxim and Arthur II at Myrig are monumentally represented in a vast array of manuscript evidence. Their ancestors and descendants are prolifically exhibited throughout British historical record. They are far from being vague, obscure, shadowy, mystical figures. The research combination of an Englishman and a Welshman allowed Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett to avoid pitfalls of national, regional, parochial and racial prejudices, which are clearly evident in the majority of volumes written on King Arthur. Everyone wants King Arthur to be theirs and not somewhere else or someone else's. Mainly the anti-Welsh bias, so clearly obvious in many modern scribblings, could be avoided. Anyone who doubts that petty nationalism has not clouded the vision of the judgment of many writers should reread their books again. Free from the idiocies and fakes of Glastonbury, Cadbury Hill and Tintagel, the search for two real-life King Arthurs could proceed in a clinical, dispassionate manner. A vast mass of evidence was available, contrary to the universal scholastic opinion that what little was known about King Arthur had to be analysed and dissected for every possible angle, many times over. There was a huge amount of untouched information together with a vast array of misconstrued evidence. Instead of a lack of evidence, there was almost an unmanageable glut. In 1127, William of Malmesbury had quoted from the manuscript of Maelgwn of Llandaff to locate the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. It is the location of Joseph's tomb, which in fact is a fundamental to frame the prominence given to Glastonbury. It seems to have bothered no one that Maelgwn of Llandaff was Welsh, and that Llandaff is in Cardiff, just 1 mile north of the castle. It seems not to have occurred to anyone that the Welsh histories and much evidence state that this area became Christian in the last year of Tiberius, in 36 AD. It seems to have escaped everyone's notice that this Maelgwn of Llandaff can be traced to a brother, King Myrig, the father of King Arthur II. Most of all, it has escaped everyone's attention that the multitudinous Welsh records accurately trace the tomb of kings as far back as the apostolic period, and that the Welsh who have held their lands for almost 4,000 years continuously do not lose important graves. The grave and church ruin described by Maelgwn of Llandaff still exists. It is nowhere near Somerset, nor is it in Glastonbury. The location of the tomb of King Arthur I was described accurately by Caraddoc of Llancarvan, and Llancarvan is just 9 miles west of Cardiff. This record was set down in 1156 and clearly relates to the tomb of King Arthur I, son of Maxim Wledig, who would have died around 400 to 420. No less that a staggering total of 9 authentic historical accounts survive detailing the death, embalming, transportation, keeping and burial of the mighty King Arthur II at Myrig ap Tudrig would have died in 579, just as the grave of his paternal ancestor Arthur I, son of Maxen, exists. So also does the grave of Arthur II. When Arthurian sagas began to flood across Europe following the Norman conquest of England and their penetration into southeast Wales in 1091, 2 writers played up the leading roles in spreading the Arthurian tales. First, there was Walter Map, who was the son of Blondel Dimap, who had married Nerfydd, the daughter of the Lord Gwirydd of Llancarvan in the Vale of Glamorgan. The half-Welsh, half-Breton Walter Map surrendered his inheritance back to his Welsh kinsman and went off to serve the English king. The South Welsh and the Britons were ancient kinsmen, and the marriage follows a normal pattern. The point is that Walter Map was from Glamorgan. The other author of Arthurian sagas was Gruffydd ap Arthur, the nephew of the Bishop of Llandaff, and himself a cleric at that cathedral. He is more widely known as Geoffrey of Monmouth, and he probably used the Bructicidio as the basis for his History of the Kings of the Britons, which extolled King Arthur as one person, again a man from Cardiff, and tradition holds that he wrote this book in the ancient market town of Monmouth in Gwent. Gruffydd ap Arthur dedicated his book to the half-Welsh, half-Norman Lord of Glamorgan and Earl of Gloucester, Robert the Consul. This Robert, the Conus, was son of Henry I, and Nest, daughter of Iestyn ap Gwrgan, the King of Glamorgan, deposed in 1091. Always the trail leads back to Glamorgan and Gwent. Some historical blunderers place Nest as the daughter of a 90-year-old Rhys ap Tudur of West Wales, causing needless confusion. So the explosion of Arthurian legends and romances which swept across early medieval bursts from southeast Wales, yet somehow 20th century writers on Arthur have persisted in avoiding all mentions of this area. This is strange indeed, when it is most realised that the dynasty of Glamorgan and Gwent is easily the best and most detailed of Western Europe in the Dark Ages. One Welsh manuscript stated to have set out in 1106 in its present form, the 6th year of Henry I, actually states that Camelot was in southeast Wales. The Lives of the Saints list King Arthur II as holding a meeting of reconciliation with St Gildas at Llancarvan around 570, just 9 miles from Cardiff, and the annals support this. This same Arthur executed Hwyl, the brother of Gildas, at Rhuthun, on a stone block still extant. The Life of St Gwynllew records Arthurius and Gwynllew of Newport area near Gelliger, common in Gwent. This same King Arthur later won a court case at Usk against St Cadoc, the son of Gwynllew and Gladys, the daughter of Brychan, again in Gwent. This same Arthur quarrelled with St Paddan, a distant cousin, at Llanbadarn Fawr Monastery. It becomes impossible to see how Arthur II, who fought the Saxons, could be any other than the well-documented Arthur, son of Myrig, son of Tudrig. The apparent aversion of writers to Glamorgan and Gwent is almost inexplicable. What actually confronted Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett was a wall of prejudice, which projected a few chosen theories and ideas. Nobody appeared to want to admit that the Glastonbury and Cadbury Hill known forgeries were in fact fakes and frauds, and the clear evidence is that there is no 6th century fortress at Tintagel. was avoided continuously. Although a monastic settlement clearly existed, it was as if an abandonment of these deceptions would leave a total vacuum and a complete blank. What emerged was that whilst a facade of industrious Arthurian researchers exists, the reality is that no real research is evident anywhere. Scholars do not go back to square one and all start over again just to see where things went wrong. They invariably resort to constantly quoting each other's repetitious work. The same limited number of ancient misquotations are constantly regurgitating within the same mental straitjackets of Glastonbury Abbey, Cadbury Hill, Tintagel, fake panoramas. What is amazing is that before the accession of Henry VII of North Wales' descent to the throne of England in 1485, everyone in England firmly believed that King Arthur was a king of Glamorgan. This did not suit Henry VII, who made great play of his descent from the ancient kings of Britain. Henry VII himself, a senior heraldic office, set up a commission of Welsh bards and heralds to his 2 parents, his 4 grandparents, his 8 great-grandparents, to their 16 ancestors, the previous 32, and so on, to admit to the centuries of savage warfare between senior South Wales kings and Gwynedd princes of the north would not have suited Henry Tudor's political purpose, and particularly as both Arthur I and Arthur II would have traced back to Glamorgan and Gwent king lines. 11 years before Henry VII became king, one William Caxton set up his printing press in London. Before 1474, everything included the historical brutes had to be handwritten, and the advent of printing process rapidly began to change all that. The mass production of printed books not only made keeping of handwritten manuscripts obsolete, but it has also made state control and implied censorship of unwise works more possible. In 1906, the English Manuscript Society invited Frederick Brie of Marlborough in Germany to edit the Brutes of England. In 1908, they published his works. Brie had referred to 167 major historical brutes, and he had used 147 of those in his survey, before using 3 representative major manuscripts to produce a compendium of what all the brutes recorded. Chapter 79 of the Brutes is remarkable. Quote, King Arthur is described as in Brittany, and when Arthur and his knights feasted at April after net sowing, he came again into Britain, his own land, and after Winstontide net sowing, by counsel of his barons, he would be crowned King of Glamorgan. This clear statement that King Arthur of the Dark Age fame, crowned King of Glamorgan, should have aroused some interest somewhere in the field of Arthurian study. All the more so as the multitude of historical documents listing the Glamorgan kings list 6th century King Arthur, son of King Meurig, son of Theodoric, or Athros ap Moegrig ap Tudrig. Winston Churchill, in his History of the British People, stated that South East Wales origins of Arthur, but being most able politician, he went no further and avoided sailing into dangerous waters. The realisation that everything seems to have changed with the accession of the Tudors to the English throne is vital understanding. What has happened subsequently, it is no longer strange that Henry VIII should have allowed wild forgeries and place the name changes of John Leyland around Cadbury in 1534. The Tudors were arch forgers and fakers, causing a false hump to be painted onto the portrait of Richard III, rewriting large sections of state papers and calendars. Probably Henry VII was responsible for the murder of 2 boy princes of the House of York in London. The Tudors may provide the clue to the lopsided and hopelessly bent historians, which even today masquerade as historians of Wales. The standard versions of Welsh history are in fact nothing more than inflated histories of the barren, mountainous regions of Gwynedd in northwest. The preposterous density, populated and fertile kingdom of southeast Wales is obliterated from these records. Sufficient quality information survives for a well-balanced and more accurate version to be set out. But the general line of the establishment is to adhere to the nonsensical Tudor-style inflations of the far northwest. The kings of Wales appear nowhere and are clearly an embarrassment. Throwing out the Welsh kings and dispossessing them from the histories automatically means throwing out the Glamorgan King Arthur. Very early on in their quest, Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett realised that a vast effort would be required to clean up the historical mess of Wales and expose the multitude of Welsh forgeries, misdirections to the public. This can be demonstrated in order to make the point that when in 1869 the Scot William F. Skene published his book on Dark Age Arthurian studies, he required someone to decipher and translate a large number of the most important Dark Age Welsh historical manuscripts for him, particularly the ancient historical poems. So he enlisted the aid of a North Wales county vicar, one the Rev. Robert Williams. The result was a catastrophe. To give an example of the disaster, we can take one line from Marnad Uther Pendragon, the grave eulogy of Uther Pendragon. Here, the Rev. R. Williams produced monks howled like dogs in a kennel, when what is written is provably monks carried the ruler to the choir. The catalogue of disasters is staggering at this blunderer proceeding to utterly mutilate Welsh history. In the Songs of the Graves from the Black Books of Carmarthen, the errors are both legion and frightening. All the more so as the Songs of the Graves lists the locations and physical descriptions of the graves of long dead kings, including King Arthur II. Williams failed totally to see that these songs were a great complaint and admonishment, a stricture lamenting the neglect of these decaying graves of the dead, the great dead. The Rev. R. Williams' destructive masterpiece was in verse number 44 and 45, where the grave of King Arthur II is minutely described. Most kings are allotted one verse. Some have 2 verses, whilst others, notably Mugant, have 3 verses. Williams is an amazing series of schoolboyish howlers. Decided that King Arthur only had 1 line. And even this is misconstrued. He came up with "A knoweth bid bed Arthur," translated as "Concealed is the grave of Arthur." This has played a huge part in creating 20th century King Arthur mystery, because forever after 1869, scholars have lazily referred to Skene's published versions. And no one appears to have gone back to square one to conduct a complete reappraisal of "Concealed is the grave of Arthur." Indeed, one light-headed Welsh professor at Oxford abused this line. Not wise is the thought, a grave of Arthur. A total invention, which was again much publicised. The fact is that instead of one cryptic line in the Songs of the Graves referring to King Arthur, there are 2 whole accurate descriptive verses, and someone somewhere ought to have seen this decades, if not centuries ago. Verse 44. The grave of the knight, the grave of the wrathful one, the grave of the angry red sword, A bare exposed place is the grave of Arthur. A grave extremely windy, a narrow place, a damp wet place, the field of grievous error, of reproach, helpless drunkenness, the duty of the chiefs to bear him hither. Far from the one line with a knoweth, meaning concealed, we have first a knoweth, meaning a bare exposed place. What the songs of the graves actually tells us is that one, the grave is in a field named Maes Mevatuk. It is exposed, bare. It is in a narrow field. It is in a very wet field. It is in a very windy place. This is in fact, it turns out to be true, as finding this Maes Mevatuk is no problem at all. The physical description is absolutely accurate. The extent of this huge historical minefield created by Rev. R. Williams and other romantic 19th century non-historians can be gauged from the following simple example. For instance, Bed Ulchwith is rendered as the grave of Elchwith, as if Elchwith was not a person, yet El clearly means extremely, and Chwith simply means windy. There was no person named Elchwith. Number 1. In verse number 1, Williams proceeded to read Curwyd a Curthwyd as being the names of 3 people named Curwyd or Kirwyd and Cow, which is hilarious nonsense, where the situation not so serious. In fact, the line reads, "The tall thou art, with clear course, kinship, decent and kinship." The verse is dealing with the importance of remembrance of ancestry and heritage of knowing who you are. In verse 2, Williams came up with another howler, translating the last line as names of 3 people named Guruen, Morian and Moriel. In fact, these are again not people at all, and it reads, "To do homage to the cold multitude and the calm multitude, the dead." The stark tragedy is that these totally inaccurate and inadequate translations have been republished in a myriad of volumes and learned papers. They have become what is commonly known as dinosaurs in print. The deeper Wilson and Blackett delved into the mass of translations of vital Dark Age records, the greater the quagmire and morass appeared. Nothing could be trusted at all. The accuracy of songs of the graves is remarkable. Owen Vinthi, the Sir Gawain of legends, lies buried at Llinhelleth, and his grave mound is there. Bedwyr at Pedrog, the Sir Bedivere figure, is said to be on the steep at Dindyfren Castle, and there on the steep slope between the outer and inner ramparts in his grave around. Scythenin is at Abergynolwyn, Kinkerry ap Caid at Hen Eglois, Kincaid at Penturk, and so on, all plainly visible and extant. The evidence, however, has been mutilated. Welsh villains and historical demolition exploits abound, perplexingly in their vast destructive efforts have been praised and lauded. If the vicar Rev. R. Williams wreaked havoc, then the Merthyr Tydfil chemist Thomas Stevens bludgeoned Welsh history, and with it King Arthur II into chaos. Yet even these walking disasters pale by comparison with the incredible Baron Munchausen figure of one J. Glenarvan Evans of Bangor. This amazing Ford claimed to have intuition. He could tell by his intuition which historical record had been altered, although not why or when or by whom. He claimed to know not only which words completely change, but also which words have been added in, and astonishingly, which have been left out. He then extended this intuition into phrases, whole lines, and even whole verses. He could add in, omit, or delete, or move around whole phrases, words, lines, and verses like pieces on a chessboard. This astounding and audacious faker took the famous Prethau Annwn, meaning the migration, to settle Annwn, and altered to King Richard's voyage to Tyre and Acre, and even asserted the name of Saladin into the mangled text. He did, however, inform his English readers of his technique and additions. He took the fabled epic of Gododin and retitled it, and proceeded to change this account of the terrible massacre at CADW peace conference in 466, where the Saxon Hengist and his followers brought concealed weapons to the conference and murdered 363 British leaders. Into the battle poem of 1098. No longer was it a story of murder after too much beer had been drunk and the massacre remembered down the ages, but instead it became an account of the battle between the Earl of Shrewsbury and Chester, allied with all the Lords of North Wales against 3/4 Irish Cuthifid ap Cynan and his ally Magnus, King of Norway. Given his own self-proclaimed intuition and his rules to add, omit, change and alter anything and everything, G.J. Evans would have no trouble at all with turning Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf into the Holy Bible. In his Gododin publication, he listed 340 word alterations in a 7,300 word poem, and stated that this was an abbreviated list. This madman vowed that all Dark Age Welsh poems and records were in fact 12th century and tried to prove it. The shameful fact is that he is often credited with laying the foundation of modern Welsh scholarship. It is small wonder that serious scholars were unable to trace the Glamorgan Gwent Arthur amidst the mayhem. The easy way to a prominent but fake ascent into reputation is to become a demolition expert. Simply destroy the records and relics, and you no longer have to face the difficulties and problems of sorting them out. Few of these scholars could stomach admitting "I don't know," and it was far easier to wreck the evidence and to declare the manuscript muddled. The scholars were not muddled, by the ancient records were. Another demolition expert was G.J. Williams, who singled out the circa 1780 and to 1827 Glamorgan antiquarian Edward Williams as his target, without one shred of credible evidence. And without a scrap of proof, he declared Edward Williams a forger. As Edward Williams was long dead and defenceless, he was a perfect target. And as he had copied out many Glamorgan manuscripts by hand, it was possible to smear and degrade all Glamorgan Gwent history. G.J. Williams actually accused Edward Williams of forging the ancient Colburn alphabet, disregarding the fact that these also appear on inscribed stones in England, Scotland and Wales between the years 200 and 950 AD. He also ignored the fact that these alphabets appear in the Bodleian Library manuscript of number 572 in Oxford, set down long before Edward Williams was born. The truly amazing feature about these Welsh devastations is that none of these patently obvious asinine attacks, which are an affront and a disgrace to honest scholarship and endeavour, are ever challenged. They succeed by default. What exists is a comprehensive, coherent and very accurate set of records of massive historical importance. The ravings of deluded demolition experts need to be set aside. Scholars are always faced with a choice when confronting ancient records. 1. They can say, the records are valid, but I do not comprehend them, i.e. I am muddled. 2. They can say, the records are invalid and muddled, and only I understand matters. It is the acid test of humility. Records cannot be discarded, altered and abused to make them fit with academic theory. The records are all we have. This then was quicksand upon which Wilson and Blackett have to tread. Fools who tore down and denigrated what they could not comprehend are lauded as authorities and experts, and their absurdities are proclaimed as standard works. The search for King Arthur is almost confronted by conspiracy rather than mystery. Whatever might have happened in England following the Tudor accession and Caxton's introduction of a printing press in 1485 and 1474, the Glamorgan Gwent tradition took a great deal of killing off in these native areas. Book after book was published down the centuries, all firmly stating King Arthur was son of King Meurig and the grandson of King Tudrig. In Irhenafion Cymraeg, Haynes, published in around 1760, King Arthur is firmly stated to be Arthur, son of Meurig, and the grandson of Tudrig of Glamorgan and Gwent, on pages 66 and 71. Not only is Arthur II identified, but Uther Pendragon is explained as a title, which it is, and contemporary bards related to Arthur ap Meurig are discussed, i.e. Llywarch Hen, Sir Lamorak, Merddin Wilt, Martin the Wild, and Taliesin, the Merlin figure. The ancient Black Book of Carmarthen was published by the Manuscript Society, clearly stating that Arthur I was son of Maxim Weledig or Magnus Maximus, and that he killed Gratian, the Roman Emperor. See King Lists number 4 in the King List numbers 28 and 29. The Glamorgan kings exhibited include Tudrig, Meurig and Arthur, and so on. In a note to list number 25, the exact location of Glastonbury is clearly stated. The 1776 History of Monmouthshire again lists the South Wales kings in a volume written by David Williams of Oxford. This includes all the major figures, adding in Gwertherin, Vortigern, whose territories were Innergunning and Uwjas, later incorporated into Hereford, and giving vital clues to identifying Gwertherin, monarchs of men. Magnus also appears, as does Tudrig, Meurig and Arthur. In fact, Arthur is clearly identified as the predecessor of Morgan. Samuel Lewis, in his Topographical Dictionary of Wales, published in 1833, exhibited what dozens of other similar topographical and learned itineraries stated, that Arthur was king of Glamorgan and son of Meurig ap Tudrig. The entry on Llandaff reads, the first church of this place was built by Tudrig ap Teichfelt, commonly called Tudrig, the martyr grandfather of the renowned King Arthur, about the year 450. The date 450 is provably too early by some 50 years, but otherwise the statement holds up. The general Glamorgan entry
in this compilation gives remarkable detail on Tudrig, Arthur and later descendant kings. It also mentions the long book of Thomas Truman as an ancient manuscript used by David Williams for his 1776 history, and it is remarkable that Edward Williams, who also copied this Thomas Truman old manuscript, should have been accused of forging it by G.J. Williams in 1945. The point is that the information is more difficult to miss than it is to find. In 1815, Thomas Rees produced his History of South Wales, identifying Teithfelt, Theodosius, Tudrig, Theodric and Myrig on page 560. He proceeded to state that King Arthur was the son of King Myrig on page 561, and detailed this line of succession through the Morgan, son of Arthur page on 562 to 563. All of this were simple common knowledge. William Owen of Oxford identified King Arthur, son of Myrig and grandson of Tudrig, in his volume The Cymry in 1891 on pages 76 and 77 and 84 and 85. These authors were serious and determined scholars with depth knowledge of these histories. There is no point in going on listing multitude of similar South East Wales publications. They seem to have not been studied or read outside of Wales. They simply reinforce that mass of inauthentic evidence of this Arthurian dynasty found in an array of impeccably authentic manuscripts of considerable antiquity. Another of the hosts of authors and researchers who clearly identified King Arthur was John H. Parry in his volume The Cambrian Plutarch, published in London in 1824. In chapter 1 on page 3, he states Arthur was the son of Myrig ap Tudrig, a prince of the Silurian Britons, and at the commencement of the 6th century, who is in all probability to be identified with our hero's reputed sire Uther, or Uther of legendary celebrity. For the custom of adopting assumed appellations was by no means unusual for the Britons at that age, and hence the epithet Uther, or wonderful, may naturally have been appropriated by Myrig, whose exploits in the wars with the Saxons appear to have given him a claim to such distinction. So John Parry not only identified Arthur, but he also was solving Uther Pendragon mystery as well. Arthur and his father Myrig and his grandfather Tudrig were all styled Uther Pendragon, as so was Carawn, Casnar and Gwythelin before them. As Parry and countless other Welsh authors stated, Uther Pendragon is a title and not a name peculiar to any one person. The foreign Silures, as usual, jars and offends, and correctly, Eswith is the name meaning abounding with prospects. Silures is alien and meaningless. The Brecon manuscript, or Harleian 4181, and British Museum Vespasian's AX1V lists these kings from Mutilated and Arthur I down to Teithfelt and Tudrig, and to Queen Marshall, the sister of King Myrig, and her son Brecon, the first cousin of Arthur. The Llandaff charters support these dynastic identities in detail, and in turn the Llancarvan Abbey supports those of Llandaff Cathedral. All three series of the Welsh triads exhibits the Arthurs in dozens of entries. The identifications are staggering and stultifying in their quantity. It is not so much a matter of knowing the answers as one of knowing the questions. For example, vast amounts of scholastic time have been wasted in trying to explain how King Einar was able to make land grants to Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, which referred to land along the River Tamar in the far west. The problem is that King Einar did not control Devon and Cornwall, and would only have found it difficult to grant lands outside of his territories in the early 8th century. No one seems to have bothered with the Welsh statement from one of Britain's greatest manuscripts, which places Glastonbury in Warwickshire. It occurs to no one that King Einar lived with Queen Ethelfleda at Tamworth on the River Tame, and that he might be granting lands among this Tame River and not on Tamar of Devon. Cornwall, the convoluted, ingenious solutions and mental gymnastics involved in the problem disappear, and a mass of local place names decipher into Welsh to identify the areas of Einar's grants. The question that Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett asked was, where was Glastonbury? The answer is near Lichfield in the Midlands. The next question was, where is King Arthur II buried? And the answer is South East Wales, as 9 records say he is. It requires no great leap of imagination to see that if Arthur II ruled from areas of Glamorgan and Gwent, and the main residence of this British dynasty was at Camelot, the fortress, that Camelot might be the Norman French Camelot. Nor should it amaze anyone that the castle was known as Coburd, with the meaning of mutually together table. The problem is not finding King Arthur I or Arthur II, but in getting the hordes of people who have vested interests in obstructing these discoveries. The truth, however, needs no apologist. The story of these two King Arthurs is what's following these pages of this work relates. The truth of the whole truth and nothing but the truth. This is no rhetorical or trite statement, for it means overthrowing the practice of selective quotation, whereby only the limited historical information which suits and supports politically popular and religiously popular and racially popular preferences is included. From the beginning of their project, both Wilson and Blackett decided that they would not indulge in the frantic scramble through approved manuscripts, searching for bare mentions of the name Arthur. Instead, they decided that they would reconstruct the Arthurian kingdom as far as it was possible. They would take both of the King Arthur candidates, Arthur son of Magnus and Arthur son of Myrig, and lead forward to them from the earliest times with their ancestors. They would be surrounded each with these contemporaries and trace onwards their descendants. They would in fact fit both correctly into the framework of British history. In this context, where a special consideration as the British kingdom of King Arthur was indisputably a long and firmly held Christian kingdom, the medieval pilgrim tourist bonanza enjoyed for centuries by the mendacious monks of Glastonbury was based in no small measure upon the historical tradition of Joseph of Arimathea establishing Christianity in Britain in apostolic times. The whole ethos of the Arthurian romances and sagas is inextricably bound up with this concept of an apostolically founded Christian state. Therefore, the Christian foundation stories and histories had to be researched, and with these the record of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was most certainly not buried at Somerset. Every possible source would be examined. Records can be written in scrolls or books of parchment, vellum or paper, but they cannot be cut or painted onto wood or carved into stones. Ancient inscribed stones are in fact contemporary historical documents, and no less than 4 stones in Glamorgan carry the name and information concerning King Arthur at Myrig ap Tudrig, Even this extraordinary circumstance has been ignored. The several hundred Dark Age inscribed stones of Wales and a number in England and Scotland have been a remarkable tale to tell. Re-establishing correct historical chronological order was to become an overriding consideration. In this context, the names hidden behind titles would need to be discovered. Uther Pendragon is a title approximating to a wonderful commander-in-chief, and at last 6 kings used this title. The Uther Pendragons would need to be traced and identified. Cadvan means many battles, whilst Caswallon means ruler of the separated state, and Cadwallader means battle sovereign. And these, along with Gwytherin, monarch of men, would need to be identified by their personal names. Basically, Wilson and Blackett intended to go back to original sources and to completely ignore modern theories which were clearly causing a consistent drift away from narratives of ancient historical texts. The most important issue in solving the problems created by political and racial religious bias and prejudice is to identify locations of historical importance. From the outset, Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett decided to use the whole range of maps and other topographical evidence available to them. The utterly hypocritical and unprofessional prejudice invariably found in previous research, where information was mangled and abused to suit fake sites in the south and southwest of England, would be abandoned. The use of maps is far more important than it might at first appear, as also the ancient written geographical and topographical evidence. What is the point in attempting to mutilate evidence to make it appear that 2 of the great battles fought by King Arthur II, when he returned from Brittany to suppress Mordred ap Llw ap Cynfarch Oer, took place at Portsmouth and Camelford in a ludicrous Cornwall River ford? The Battle of Longborth must surely have happened at Longborth on Cardigan Bay, where a mass place names support this dire event. The Prince Geraint was killed in the fighting, and his Maurnad grave elegy is quoted by every Arthurian author. Yet Bedd Geraint farm is still at Longborth, and the Bedd Geraint grave of Geraint mound is still there. How can the stone of Blederi, the son of Myrig of David, be avoided near this battle site? The young prince who passed into legend as Sir Bleharis or even Sir Bleobaris. The Battle of Camlan was surely fought at Camlan, just inland from Longborth, where again grave mounds of dead soldiers litter the well-known battlefields, still remembered by the local inhabitants. Camlan Valley, just 10 miles south of Godalgethlai, the great scatter of war cemetery grave mounds, attests to a fearsome struggle at this narrow, rugged valley. Welsh ancient records speaks of Mynydd Camlan, which means mountains. This immediately rules out the paternocervities of Salisbury Plain and Camelford. The same applies to momentous Battle of Mynydd Baden, historically said to be close to the banks of the River Severn. Mynydd Baden is still marked on modern government ordnance survey maps in the Maesteg Valley, just 7 miles from the shores of the Severn, which is visible from the mountains. Not only is a mountain as specified, but the large smooth eastern slopes are still Maes Cadlawr, or Field of the Battle Area. A huge grave mound enclosed the vast numbers of dead. A mass corroborative names support the location, the road to the site being For y Gyfraith, road to the tumult, The encampments are the field of the white tents, and so on, with a dozen other identifications. The abandonment of Mynydd Baden in favour of the absurd Badbury rings in the south of England is nowhere. The River Severn fits the patterns of ignoring the Mynydd Camelot and Llanborth battle sites in favour of the obviously ludicrous Portsmouth and Camelford. Looking at maps and atlases, it is very plain and straightforward and simple matter, and a great many authors have a great many questions to answer. When an ancient poem that states that Prince Geraint was killed at Llanborth battle around 572, and maps and place names show both Llanborth and Bedd Geraint, the grave of Geraint, it quite definitely raises some serious questions over the integrity and seriousness of most previous research. The same applies to a host of other clearly named, clearly marked out ancient sites in ancient texts, not least the Joseph of Arimathea gravesite. Battle sites near the correctly named, and with vast war cemeteries still existing and supported by a welter of names like the Bloody Well, the Dell of Slaughter, the Field of Blood, and so on, need to be taken very seriously. It is actually an affront to our ancestors that they would have forgotten such tragic and monumentous sites. The people of South East Wales were the Cymry dwelling in Eswylllyn, which was misnamed Siluria by the Romans. To the Romans, these were the most ferocious and deadly enemies that they had ever faced. So it's not really surprising that one of the two King Arthurs was a Silurian. Their military traditions under King Caradog ap Arg, who fought these Romans from 42 to 51 AD, and knew his nephew King Kerry ap Caed, who carried on the war until AD 74, are awesome. From here, King Caraun, known as Caractacus, the Emperor and Admiral, ruled, declaring Britain again independent from Rome. His tombstone is the Carmarthen Museum. Others who are unknown outside this region tore at the Romans, who they several times ejected until finally in 337, long before the favourite academic dating of 411. From the outset, Wilson and Blackett were determined to place the Arthurian locations precisely where the records and evidence states them to be. The more difficult and obscure locations in the West Midlands of modern England surrounding King Arthur I would be supported by the later, better preserved locations of Arthur II in his direct descendants. Huge amounts of solid evidence, which until now have been persistently discarded and ignored simply because they could not have fitted into the absurdities of the Badbury Rings, Portsmouth, Cadbury Hill, Glastonbury, Tintagel scenario, would be examined on their merits and not their tourist potential. Welsh historical records would be treated as historical and not as childish, mystical, dream-like ideals. As neither of the two Arthurs fought to preserve Rome or foreign alien Romanism, this patently incorrect theory would not be followed unless solid evidence emerged to support it. Gwertherin Vortigern was not a mystery figure. His grave still exists at Nant Gwertherin, and it was opened in 1776. His real identity is concealed and misread in epic poetry. Taliesin, the Merlin figure, has not vanished. His grave is marked clearly on Ordnance Survey maps as Bedd Taliesin. All that has to be done is to ignore the fantasies and delusions which have befogged and obscured the well-recorded and obvious histories. Cadbury Hill is irrelevant, and so is Glastonbury Abbey. And having discarded these fakes, sanity can be restored. The Dark Age history of Britain has to be reorientated by switching back to the correct geographical areas. The most obvious necessity is to point out that when ancient manuscripts refer to Kernil, they refer directly to Kernil, and not the remote strategy and tactically irrelevant Cornwall. Kernil is on modern maps lying in south east Wales between Cardiff and Newport. The name Coed Kernil and Llangernil still appear. It is the region of the King's Cantref, or the privileged Cantref, and the major residence of the powerful Welsh kings is here. The fabled Camelot or Cibor castle ruins are here. The yellow fortress or mutually together table that Camelot became Norman French Camelot is obvious to the rational, unbiased reader. With Kernil reinstated correctly as it is and always was at the seat of power in the Arthurian dynasty in southeast Wales, the search for the two Arthurs can begin, mentally freed from the bogus Cornwall and liberated from John Leyland's known forgeries at Cadbury Hill and the great monkish hoard of 1191 at Glastonbury Abbey. The records can be read and interpreted as they are, and not as those with vested interests wish them to be.